Okay, the last of the personal question is what are some of your your favorite non RPG books
Oh,
and some of your favorite writers?
lots and lots. No, I mean I um for novelists, um,
Yep.
for example, um, I have a long history of reading all the works of a given writer once I get interested in them. So, two mid 20th century, later 20th century writers who had a big impact on me were Vladimir Nabokov and Anthony
Hmm.
Burgess, um, who each have very well known popular works, but I decided that I wanted to read the broad range of their work.
All
And
of
they're not
them.
alone. There are many writers that I've done this with, and those two, however, occupied a lot of my attention. They're both dead, and I got interested in them before they died. And what that meant was that their books were very, very hard to find.
I
Many of them were
understand.
out
Yes.
of print. Of course, after they died, then all their
Yeah.
books suddenly appeared. And I was
Yeah.
irritated. I was like, I spent a decade trying to find that thing, you know. So
And this is when you decided to don't not follow trends and to have a phase difference so
mm,
that
I don't know if I ever really decided that. Um, but uh, the other names that are worth talking about, if we go to science fiction and fantasy, um, you might be interested to know that before recently, nobody distinguished between Robert E. Howard's Conan stories and anyone else's.
yeah,
And most people just read books with Conan on the cover, and
and they didn't know.
right there before, and they didn't even reference the authors by story. You actually had to go and read the tiny print in the beginning of the book to find out who actually
Yes.
wrote each story. And so it had a very homogenizing effect. And so I learned that Conan had original stories in the first place when I was 12 because I was reading Conan the Barbarian, the comic book. And
Yes.
at that time, they only had the license for the Howard stories. So this was the one way you could actually have contact with Conan by Howard,
Yeah.
were those adaptations. So that led me to go and actually pay attention to the authors when I read the stories, when I found them. And so I became very deeply invested in both the structure and historical origins of the stories, as well as the difference between how they were presented in market terms versus how they originated. Um,
Howard's Howard is one of my favorites as well.
mhm.
I think that there is a distinctive pacing in his stories that is very difficult to achieve
I
in fun.
completely agree. There is the very amazing writer. I mean, if we're going to talk about great writers of science fiction and fantasy, Fritz Leiber is clearly, you know, a leader.
Yeah.
And Leiber wrote an essay about Howard a long time ago.
Mhm.
And he had one phrase in it that I have never forgotten, which is he was comparing him to Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Yes.
And he said that Howard had a murkier mind than Burroughs, but he had
Yes.
twice the poetry. And I
He's
completely agree. Howard was effectively a poet. He wrote a lot of poems, but they're not so great. His poetic medium was prose.
yes.
Yeah.
I get that. Though there are some of his poems that I really like.
Yeah, I agree, but there's a lot of Kipling in them. You know, these kind
Yeah.
of quick little jingle kind of poems more than anything else,
Yeah.
and they have too
Yeah.
much story, right? Just like Kipling, they have too much story. But
I don't mind it.
yeah,
I can appreciate some storytelling.
well, so anyway, yes, Howard's writing was important to me. I think something that really strikes people when they read it too is although the stories, like anybody who pumps out hundreds of stories in a very brief period, their quality is very different from story to story. That's not hard to understand. What
Yes.
is striking about it is that it's the authenticity, the feeling that he meant it is so strong. It's a quality that people who want to be writers are told you have to have it. But most professional writers actually lose it because it's not very practical.
Yes.
And so he never lost it. Howard never stopped being a completely idealistic writer, that if he meant it and got it on the page, that was good.
I know, and it's actually quite easy to see that some of his stories he didn't mean it.
Right. Oh yeah, there's a few. Yeah, you're right. You can
Yeah,
tell. But
let's
it's
write something, to make some money, something
right.
like that.
Right. There are a few. Now, I will also point out that many of his manuscripts that were picked up by people like Lynn Carter and turned into published stories are often quite terrible. So
They are
you look at them and you say, Carter, you really should have left it. He left it in the desk for a reason. no,
yeah,
um,
yeah. I think that Carter, it's Carter's fault.
well, in many ways, Carter, in my opinion, is contributed an immense amount to pop culture simply by keeping the authorship and the stories, by keeping the stories alive through a period when
Yes,
they probably would have structurally disappeared. And
correct, and
that's
maybe he
true.
did some world building too.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. He contributed a lot in terms of hobbydom. He to me is the Uber fan.
Yes,
Right.
precisely.
Yeah. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that his critical capacity as a fan, anything is good. Right.
Yeah,
And there to fandom, if George Lucas puts it out, right, good.
sadly,
Right, of course. But
sadly.
but fandom is like that. And so
Yes,
Carter could go in that direction. Um, and so it's interesting. But yes, I as you know from if you've read my supplement for Sorcerer and Sword was my attempt to return an awareness of that to the hobby. And in terms of minor achievements, I think Sorcerer and Sword had an immense impact.
they
So
did. They did.
I'm very happy about that.
We're going to get back to them later. I have questions.
Sure.
Two more. Let me drop two more names. Clark Aston Smith.
Of course. If you read Howard, and then if you're like me and read a little more, and
Yeah,
then you suddenly pick up this other author, it's a little bit like if somebody tells you about detective fiction in America, and you read Raymond Chandler, and you feel as though now you are reading the real stuff, but then you learn a little bit
yeah,
more, and you learn about Dashiell Hammett, and you learn about another author um, whose pen name is Ross MacDonald, and you realize that Chandler was a piece of a puzzle, a piece of a
yeah.
structure, a larger structure. And then you start reading a lot more and you start having your own views and opinions about all these other authors. And you find some author that now you want to read everything by that person. And so uh, Clark Ashton Smith is sort of phase two for pulp fantasy,
Yes,
right? Sort of phase
he's
two.
uh, he's very different, and he is an amazing
Oh,
poet.
incredible! Yeah, incredible in terms of raw understanding of what he was doing in particular.
And the language that he
Of
uses.
course. Now the person who adopted that, who was most influenced from that, is John Holbrook Vance, who writes as Jack Vance. And
Yes,
so that's another author, also of that same age group. You'll notice that I was kind of interested in these men who were about my father's age. And I had read Heinlein and Clark and Asimov, who are all in that category, and I really didn't like them very much. And I never have. I think they're grossly overrated and that they were elevated into star status for structural reasons, not for the stories. And
Quality reads.
I mean, each one has a few good stories, but not really very many. And they that anyway. But my point is that I look at Vance's work and I say, why on earth are we talking about Arthur C. Clarke? I mean, come on. Another good example is Alfred Bester, who basically invented cyberpunk in 1956. Um, so anyway, the
To
point
be
is,
honest, I've never heard of him. I'm not very much into cyberpunk. I'm sorry, I cannot follow you
well,
here.
Bester invented cyberpunk casually in the middle of writing incredibly powerful social science fiction.
Yes.
And I recommend looking him up. He actually doesn't have that many works. It's not that hard to read all of Bester and not give up your whole life to do it. But he is truly one of the most influential. A lot of the women of the pop culture and science fiction scene, I think, are badly overlooked. There were many of them. Everybody knows about Alice Sheldon, who wrote as James Tiptree Jr., and
Yes.
everybody knows Ursula Le Guin, but that's just the beginning. There's dozens and dozens of brilliant, brilliant works from before the 80s that I think are badly overlooked. So,
I I agree.
yeah.
I agree.
So anyway, those are some things that I mean. This has occupied my attention since I was 8 years old. So I've never stopped just combing through whatever the next book led me to. Um, and I tend to think of it as an experiential research. Um, you read it, and then perhaps somebody has written an introduction and they mention some other book, or perhaps you read it and this is a terrible way to do it, but it's all we had. In the back
Yeah.
of the book were advertisements for other books, and of course they were put in there because somebody thought that if you read this
They
book
were
you might be
similar.
interested in these. Usually most of them are complete miss as far as that's concerned,
Yes.
but I always looked at them. I always looked at them and said, now what are they? If there's something there I never heard of, what is it?
Yeah.
And
Right.
so it's a very crude way of doing research but as a kid with a cheap paperback and no
Yeah.
internet.
Were they easily accessible? I mean, could you go to the
Well,
bookstore and buy
there
this?
were two things to work with. First of all, in the late 1960s, so right at the time that I learned to read, and then continuing in a very powerful way for 10 years. Um, the popular return of fantasy, mythology, and science fiction was enormous. Before that, you had to be a subscriber to the magazines.
I
But this
understand.
was the time when not only was the new stories now being published as books, but the older magazines were now all being published as author based and genre based collections.
Yeah.
So
Collections,
really,
yes.
there was an avalanche of books, and they were produced both on the bookshelves, but they were very cheap, and they instantly went to used bookstores. And used bookstores at the time were a very unusual and countercultural place to be. You could they really were a culture of their own, and it's where the magazines and the comic books and the books and the marijuana pipes and the off-duty army guys and everybody just kind of converged in those spots, and some of them were kind of expensive or fancy with pillows and candles, and then others were just crappy little places with cardboard boxes, and there were
Yeah.
hundreds of them. So as a kid I would ride my bicycle throughout the Monterey Peninsula in California and go to 10 used bookstores, and the books cost 25 cents. So I would spend all day. And when I was tired, I would
Perfect.
stop in the one with the pillows, right? So, it so to me they were very available, but it was completely unconstructed. Complete
Yes.
The only real construction you got was talking to adults.
Yeah.
So that was another thing. What
Sounds like
also,
the world before the internet.
well,
It sounds.
well, this is also important because it's the world before Blade Runner, before Aliens.
Yeah.
Star Wars, the first movie, was not the Star Wars phenomenon. That didn't really happen until the third movie in the early 80s. So, no Blade Runner, no Alien, no Next Generation Star Trek, no Star Wars, to speak of. There
Yeah.
weren't, it wasn't the same thing. Um, and a very different array. I mean, science fiction and fantasy were considered crap. They were not respected by the
Yeah.
mainstream.
I know. I know.
And if you had good fantasy or science fiction movies, then everybody would say, "Oh, that's not really science fiction."
Yeah. It's something else.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of
No
authors
Drew
were doing that.
Stockman.
No one called Kurt Vonnegut a science fiction writer. They say he had his start in science fiction, even though he wrote nothing but science fiction throughout his entire
Yeah.
career. So, anyway, the point was, though, that yes, I had a lot of contacts with that, but it took effort and it took crossing the generations. You became one of those 10-year-old kids that adults talked to like an equal because you
Yeah.
were talking about, a Fritz Lang
Stuff
story.
they like.
Right.
Yeah.